Don't blink.
Believe it or not, there's 40,000 buried bodies underneath me. It's blood-soaked in history, this place. I love walking round Manchester. I can get lost in my own little world. Just the sound of the bustling city, it makes me feel alive. Nothing makes me happier than just sitting in a pub or a coffee shop and peering out the window, just watching people do the day-to-day routine things, whether it's shopping, working, or they could just be enjoying life. But the more that I observe, the more I found myself admiring these beautiful old buildings that was left to us by an era that has been long forgotten. The beautiful grand Victorian buildings that you see today, and the old industrial warehouses and textile mills, were designed by ridiculously talented architects, and they was erected by sheer hard work and craftsmanship. The spinning mills were built in the era of the Industrial Revolution, and these were the backbones to its success. It was around this era that parts of Manchester and Salford fell into mass poverty. Immigration was on the high, and there weren't enough housing to cater for the influx of new people. This left many families eking a living from an already impossible way of life. Slum areas became nothing more than living nightmares. But spawning from the infested dwellings came a generation of youths that had terrorised the city of Manchester and Salford forever, and it had scarred its name into its history books. Ladies and gents, I give you the Scuttlers. Scuttlers used to arm themselves with weapons. These included heavy belt-buckled belts, knives, brass-tipped clogs, and they'd even hand-make items such as stones that was wrapped round in a handkerchief. And even though that the Scuttlers were very poor, and they came from the slums, they was very fashion conscious, and they wore silk scarves, belt-bottom trousers, and even peak hats. A Scuttler's haircut was distinctive. They had short back and sides, but they used to leave the fringe long. And these guys were well before the Peaky Blinders, so you can already see the impact that they had on fashion and society further down the line. A Scuttler's favourite choice of weapon was a belt. The end of the belt buckle was serious enough to do harm and possibly disfigure a rival gang member, but it wasn't enough to kill him, and ironically, that was never the Scuttlers' intention. The intention was to beat a rival gang on their own turf, and the ultimate prize was to take the belt from the head boy of the rival gang. These were treasured like football trophies in today's society. Having done a fair bit of research, I've decided to bring the story of the Scuttlers to life. And I wanted to focus on just a few of the things that I found interesting, and hopefully you will too. So I'm going to introduce some of the gangs that I'll be focusing on. So stand up, the Bengal Tigers from Bengal Street in Ancoats. The Tigers were reputed to be the most fearsome scuttling gang at the time. These guys were seasoned fighters with ill intentions, and the carnage they caused sent shockwaves around Manchester. They were known to be brutal, and they made devastating examples of anyone who dared step in the way. We had the Angel Meadow lads from Angel Meadow in Manchester, and these guys pretty much spawned from the slums. They were born into poverty and they had nothing to lose. The wild-eyed crazy members were known to be fearless in battle. Next up, we have the Buffalo Bill gang that hailed from Whit Lane in Salford. These were all tough lads that worked at Pendleton Colliery, and even though they could fight one-on-one, they liked to sneak attack their opponents and split up into groups, as opposed to fighting mob-handed as an army.
Come on then.
So I've decided to kick off this part of the vid on the infamous Jersey Street. This was the meeting point where an epic blood-soaked battle took place, and it went down in history. It was against the Pictage Street lads and the notoriously fierce Bengal Tigers. So let's go and have a look. So here I am, I'm on Bengal Street, and you wouldn't have caught me walking down here back in the 1800s, because this was the home of Manchester's most feared gang out of all the scuttling gangs. The Tigers were the most feared and the most brutal and most vicious, and they had one hell of a mob, an army with them. And as you can see, the old mill is sort of here still, but if these walls could talk, they'd definitely have a few tales to tell, and there'd have been bloodshed on these exact cobbles here. But it's so sort of surreal because you can feel the history on this street. It's crazy. You can sort of feel the tension, as daft as it sounds. But there was an epic battle with a gang called the Pictage Street lads, and it took place on Jersey Street, which is where we're going to head over now. But I just wanted to quickly go over this part of Manchester because it's absolutely stunning. If I'd have gone from that street, the end of that street, to the end of this street, there probably won't be much left of me. So here I am on Jersey Street in Manchester, and as you can see, there's like the old ruins here of some old factory, and there's mills everywhere. Now back in the 1800s, this area, Manchester, was classed as the chimney of the world, heavily polluted, just a real grim place to be. And to make it even worse, there was a gang called the Pictage Street lads that lived somewhere around here.
The Pictage Street lads, what are you going to do about it?
They wanted to have it out with the Tigers, the Bengal Tigers, because they were the most feared gang in Manchester. And what they wanted is to sort of take their crown. And in all these mills was actual scuttler workers. And there was word going round all the factories that there was going to be this one epic big battle. And the Pictage Street lads were ready for him, and they were going to absolutely destroy the Tigers.
It's going to be a big battle today, you can't miss it.
And in between sort of the two areas is this street here called Jersey Street. Now Jersey Street was the battleground for it, and it's just off Bengal Street. And they came here, the Pictage Street lads, mob-handed with 150 people. Now, that's strange to get, because when you sort of see a gang fight these days, you're talking 10-15 people, aren't you? But back then there was 150 people, so this place here would be absolutely crowded, and they'd have been screaming, stones were being chucked, everything. But they were met by the Tigers. Now don't forget, these Tigers, these were seasoned fighters. They weren't wet behind the ears, these lot, and they were waiting for him. And when they got it, the Pictage lads got here screaming and shouting. There was over 200 Tigers, and they had an epic fight here, which, even though it didn't last that long, it went down in history as being a real gory fight. There was people getting hit with belt buckles, but I won't go into the nitty-gritty of it. But basically, the Pictage Street lads thought they'd turn the Tigers over, and when they were met here, they got their, to put it blatant, they got their asses kicked. And the Tigers state the claim as being Manchester's #1 most feared gang, and they still were. And they wiped the floor with him. And it happened actually on these streets here. In the height of the scuttling era, Angel Meadow was a place you could only imagine in your deepest, darkest nightmares. Squalor, poverty and death was an all too common sight. The boom of the Industrial Revolution caused a pandemic of immigration. This was due to the amount of work that was being generated by the city of Manchester. A huge influx in Irish and Jewish immigrants came over to work in Manchester. They chose to settle in Angel Meadow, and they also settled in the notorious little island. The one up one down houses became very overcrowded, and the whole area was just overpopulated. Some houses had up to 10 people living in them. The sewage from the River Irk often poured into the cellars and dwellings where people had been sadly forced to live. One tap per row of houses was all that you could get access to for some relatively clean water.
Right, that's all you're having.
It was a fact that the ale from the pubs was actually cleaner to drink. This caused a surge in violence and disruption throughout the city. Kids as young as 13 were allowed to drink beer in the pubs. Disease and infection was rife, and to make it out of Angel Meadow over the age of 30 was an achievement in itself. It's inevitable to me that, out of all these factors, something like the Scuttlers had to have formed out of these appalling conditions of the era. Today, Angel Meadow is a beautiful park, and it's got an air of tranquility about it. But don't be fooled by its appearance. Underneath me lay 40,000 buried bodies. And it's home to a mass burial site. Where else could they have put all those people?
So here I am, and I'm in the beautiful part of Manchester called Angel Meadow, and it's a lovely park. But back in the late 1800s, you wouldn't know what we've been knocking about around here. And even though it looks very nice, and it's a beautiful time to actually film, because I love autumn. I think it's the most prettiest time of year, and the leaves have fell, and they're like on a lovely golden amber colour. And it's just beautiful on camera. I really love filming in the autumn. But let's get back to the story. You wouldn't know what I've been knocking about around here. This was it wasn't a park. There was actually a church just over here, and believe it or not, there's 40,000 buried bodies underneath me, which is absolutely like mind-boggling. Can't even put it into words. And the reason they're all buried here is because this was a congested area, and it was a place of mass poverty. It was overcrowded. I think by the mid 1850s there was 330,000 people actually in this vicinity. The hygiene was just non-existent, and everybody pretty much had tuberculosis. And then around you, where you can see today, obviously there's like glass, new glass buildings and apartments, but this would have been filled with factories just bellowing steam out, coal. There would have been textile mills. The noise would have been horrendous, but like I say, it was the boom of the Industrial Revolution and people wanted to work here. Now the Scuttlers, actually the Angel Meadow lads, were actually, this was their turf, this was their patch, and it's been known that they had mass brawls here. And like I say, they weren't fighting for money or for anything like that to win, you know, for girls. They were fighting for territory, and they were fighting to stamp authority on the other rival gang. And the main aim was sort of to maim them and to scar them as opposed to killing them. So basically, if you attacked a fellow rival gang, especially the head boy of their gang, the main thing was that you scarred them and that you did that scar. So whenever anybody ever sort of looked at them ever again, they'd know who did the scar. So it was a bad place to be, this area. So I've just been sat here on this bench here, and I thought I'd add this in. Now these slabs here that you can see just look like normal, like slabs, you know, like old paving slabs. But I've just noticed this on the side. See the little groove there? And it's like a swirl, and it almost looks like this could have been an old headstone. Absolutely, I could just be completely wrong, but it actually does look like it was an old headstone. How strange is that?
The new wave of redevelopment in Manchester tramples and flattens on our history and heritage mercilessly. Our once proud industrial scene is rapidly being disregarded and replaced by new corporate buildings. And with a flick of a finger, all that history can be gone. Nothing but a plume of smoke and a pile of rubble. But if you look carefully, sometimes the scars of what once were can still be seen. And the echoes of the past, they can still be heard. As I was leaving Angel Meadow, I stumbled across the ruins of what I thought could have been an old factory. But looking through the archives, it seems like these remnants were in fact houses. Could these houses have been home to some of the Scuttlers? I don't know. But there's a little part of me that'd like to think that there were.
So I've got a little piece of history here that some of you might not know. And you might park your car here in town and wonder what that is and what it used to be. Now, this used to be the police and the fire department back in the era of the Scuttlers. So a few of them would have been nicked and put in here. And this like the old chimney bit, the chute that you can see, that would have heated the building back in the day. And obviously it would have been a few levels above. And on the other side is like these old arched beveled doors which used to fly straight open, and the fire engines and the trucks would come rushing out and, you know, go to the emergency. But this little time capsule's still sat here in Manchester, and there's not that many. I didn't know about it until someone told me. And it's just a beautiful piece of crumbling Manchester history that actually looks like it won't be around for much longer.
Is that them Scuttlers, Sarge?
Yeah, it is. Nick 'em.
Wait, this way.
In 1871, Manchester City Police had 691 officers. They served a population of just over 350,000. This was a ratio of 1 police officer per 508 people. However, the Salford Police was an independent police force of its own, and the population stood around 220,000 at the time. But they only had 330 coppers. That meant 1 officer per 667 people. Officers in both forces were usually recruited from military backgrounds. The constables were normally found to have been ex-industrial workers or labourers. Very few local men were taken on, and the superintendents had to be extra careful that the Manchester and Salford-born officers didn't patrol the districts that they came from. If there was anything a Scuttler hated more than a rival gang, it was the police. And if the two gangs were fighting and the police came to break it up or intervene, the two scuttling gangs would join forces and attack the police.
Come on then.
But rising out of the blood-soaked cobbled streets came a man whose name would send shivers down the spine of any scuttler, no matter how fierce of a reputation they had. A man that possessed intelligence far surpassing any scuttling criminal or organised gang at the time. And he went by the name of Jerome Caminado. Jerome Caminado was born on Deansgate in 1844. His mum was Irish and his dad was Italian, and at the age of 24, he joined the Manchester Police. He was quickly promoted to sergeant and transferred to the newly formed Detectives Division. His policing style was very eccentric, and he'd often dress in disguise to gather evidence. And at the time, this is something that had never been done before. He developed a network of trusted informants, and they'd often gather at the back pew of St Mary's Church in Manchester. And to Mancunians, St Mary's Church is known as the hidden gem. Jerome rapidly built a reputation in Manchester for policing, and the most famous case he cracked was the Manchester cab murder of 1889. He traced, captured, and convicted the murderer, which led to the sentencing, all within the space of 3 weeks. And obviously, there was no forensics, CCTV or fingerprints. It was just sheer intelligence and his unique unconventional methods of detective work. Throughout his career, he was responsible for the imprisonment of around 1,200 criminals. A national figure, Jerome was thought to have been the inspiration behind Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's most successful novel, Sherlock Holmes. But unbeknown to him, his life was about to be tipped upside down by a scuttler named William Wally. William was a member of the Bradford Street Scuttlers, and he was 16 years old at the time. He worked as a maker and repairer of casks and barrels. He had a run-in with another teenage boy from a rival scuttling gang. He was called Peter Kennedy, and he was a gang member of the notorious Lime Street Boys. An incident had occurred between the two, and it left William feeling embarrassed and humiliated by Peter. William was furious, and over the next few days, he plotted a plan to confront and attack Peter. A heated fight broke out, and it resulted in William plunging a knife into the back of Peter. Peter was taken to the hospital, and sadly, over the course of a few days, he died as a result of his injuries. William was arrested, and he soon found himself in front of a judge. He was charged with willful murder and sentenced to death by hanging. William's mum began to scream hysterically in the courtroom as she couldn't believe the verdict. And he was that frantic, he had to be pinned down by 2 police officers. And so the event was scheduled. William was to be executed at Strangeways Prison. But stop right there, because the story's not over. The soon-to-be executed William Wally was secretly in a loving relationship with the daughter of Jerome Caminada. And to the plea of his beloved daughter, Caminada had no choice other than to help. A handwritten letter was sent from William to Caminada in a desperate last-ditch attempt to save his life. And so, the two agreed to meet. But the experience that Caminada had that day shook him to the very core. So much so that he actually wrote about the event, and this is what he had to say. Though I'd been visiting the prison for over 20 years, it was the first time that I'd ever been inside a condemned cell, and I hope it would have been the last. The poor lad put his arms through the bars which separated us, and the tears were streaming down his cheeks. He implored me to save him. I was much affected, and I promised I would do all in my power towards this end. Caminada quickly went to work, and he met with 2 prominent Manchester magistrates that was involved in the case. And on the other side, William's friends and relatives gathered the support of those of more humble means, and they trawled the streets of Ancoats and Angel Meadow, and by the following weekend, they had 25,000 signatures on William's behalf. The petition evidence and a stern but sympathetic letter was bundled together to the Home Secretary, and against all the odds, the decision to execute William Wally was overturned. A new sentence was given, and William was to serve 1 life of penal servitude. William Wally served 8 years for the murder of Peter Kennedy, and once he was released in 1900, he returned to Manchester with a new outlook on life. He was no longer a 16-year-old boy, but now a 24-year-old young man. He resumed his former occupation and moved to Harper, just several miles from his old stomping ground of Ancoats. And astonishingly, he went on to marry the daughter of Mr. Caminado. She was called Florence. Florence campaigned for William's release since 1892, and in 1905 they celebrated the birth of the first child. She taught for many years at a school in Angel Meadow, whilst William ended up working at a foundry. Eventually, they both died, but they was buried together at Phillips Park Cemetery. A branch of the Walling family still live nearby in Ancoats, and the story's been passed down from generation to generation.
Right, who've we got here then?
It's Bill Brooks, Sarge.
Ah, the Greengate Scuttlers.
Yeah, and apparently he's the gang leader, sir.
Right, up against the wall then, lad. Okay, write this down. 5'4", with a shallow complexion and a stocky build, and by the look of his nose, he's been in a few fights.
Idiot.
What was that, Brooks? Write down cocky next to it in description there. Put cocky. Yeah, we'll straighten him out of strange ways, don't worry. So it says here on your bio, when you're not being cocky, or fighting, or generally causing havoc, you're a brickmaker. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Alright, now smile for the camera, Brooks. Right, that'll do for today. Send him back down to his cell, boys.
Greengate is now classed as an area of Manchester city centre, but geographically it's located in Salford, and it's bounded by the River Irwell, Chapel Street, Blackfriars Road and Trinity Way, and the area was ruled by the infamous Greengate Scuttlers. Their head boy, he went by the name of Bill Brooks. Bill Brooks was a fearless individual, and he'd often leave his stomping ground at Greengate to go and fight rival gangs in Manchester. Bill's name and the reputation of the Greengate Scuttlers spread like wildfire, and gangs in and around Manchester became scared, and the stories that they'd heard would leave people petrified. He called out willingly any other scuttler for a fight, whether it was the head boy of the most brutal scuttling gang in Manchester, or it might have happened to have been a fellow Salfordian. Bill didn't care. What meant most to him is that he was number one, the toughest lad of his era. He was often arrested and taken to strange ways for committing hideous crimes and offences, but this was just the norm to Bill, and whatever happened to him later in life, I don't really know. But one thing is for certain, he stamped his place into scuttling history, and his face and name will be forever ingrained into our blood-soaked past. The next part of this vid tells a very sad and tragic tale of what can happen if you're rejected to join a scuttling gang, bullying, harassment, and sadly in this situation, an accidental death occurred. It took place on Pictage Street, which is just off Mocker Parade in Salford. But due to the redevelopment in the area since this incident occurred, it's hard to say if this is the original location. There could have been another Pictage Street somewhere in the vicinity that is now long gone. But regardless, I decided to go with my gut instinct and film. So let's head over there now and uncover what happened that fatal day.
So here I am, just off Mocker Parade, and we're going to visit this place here. It's called Pictage Street. Now, it's got an incident happened here back in the 1800s, in the height of the scuttling era, and there was a respectable young man by the name of Thomas Inglis. Now, Thomas was a very hard-working young man. He was only 18 years old, and he was everything that you wanted in a son, really. He was very respectable. He was a devout Christian. He worked, and every time he got paid, he'd empty his wages out onto the table to give to his mum and dad. He was from what I've read, he's a real nice guy. And the King Street Scuttlers tried to recruit him several times. Thomas said no. Said, look, it's not me. I'm not a scuttler. I'm not into it. And sort of refused them several times. And this angered the members of the gang. And one day Thomas was leaving his church, and he was walking home, a young girl, because it was dark at night, and you know the way that it is, he walked her home to protect her. And on his way home, he was met by 20 lads from the King Street Scuttlers. Now these chased him down. The young girl told Thomas to run.
Thomas, run!
So he set off running. He's come down, I think it was Blackfriars Road, and he's ended up round here. Now his house would have been somewhere around here at some point. Not too sure where, but exactly it were, because it's more or less gone. But this is Pictage Street here, so it said it was on Pictage Street, so it has to be here. Now, they caught up with Thomas and dished out an absolute brutal beating on him. They hit him with belt buckles, they kicked him in. They basically got the handkerchief as well and tied stones round it and absolutely stoned him. And eventually he got away. Somehow, miraculously, he got away. And he ran straight to his house, like I said, which was over here, where we're going to walk over now. And he ran in the house. Now, as he's ran in the house, his mum and dad are like, what's going on, what's up?
Who's done that?
And he's covered in blood, and his brothers, he's looked out the window, and there's a mob basically outside the house. And he said that the streets had swollen up with a crowd. Some of the scuttlers, some of them were just passerbys. And there was just basically this crowd outside the house. They were shouting at him, they were calling him names, they were shouting at his family. And he was in a rage, he was furious, and his brother passed him a poker, like an iron rod.
Go outside and stick up for yourself.
And said, go out and get, like, batter him, basically. Like, stand up for yourself. But he wasn't much of a fighter. And in a rage, he picked up this stick, this iron rod, and he's ran out onto Pictage Street. So, just cross over here now. He's ran out with this iron rod, and he's threw it just into the crowd aimlessly, just sort of aiming at the scuttlers, but there was no like indefinite like throw to anyone in particular. He just threw this iron rod into the street, and bizarrely enough, the rod bounced up off the flags and the cobbles, and it stuck into and impaled a young 10-year-old boy that died. And it's a very sad story, but it was in a fit of rage. He didn't mean to kill the young boy. He just literally threw it in a fit of rage and anger towards the crowd of scuttlers, which then impaled this poor innocent boy that was just a bystander. Now, he went to court, and the MP at the time of Salford stuck up for Thomas in court and said he was a role model, he was a model, you know, a model person, and he was defiant and not joining these scuttling gangs. And rather than sentence him, you know, there should really be sort of, the guy didn't mean it, basically, and you know, the punishment should be a bit more leaner on him. And it got reduced from murder to manslaughter, and Thomas got 2 weeks in prison and he was released. But it just goes to show that, you know, you don't have to sort of, back in them days, you didn't even have to get, you could have kept a sort of been on the straight and narrow, but they try to drag you into these situations and try to get you into these gangs, and if they didn't, they'd beat you up, they'd make your life a living hell. And sadly, Thomas and this poor boy were the victim of bullying from the scuttlers. and yeah, he basically got it dropped. They got it dropped to manslaughter, and it's just a sad situation that happened. But these walls that you see in these bricks today, these actually would have witnessed what went on that day, and it was horrific. But it was a part of the scuttling history.
Right, you go this way, I'll go that way. And if you get in trouble, don't forget the code.
The secret whistle.
So it's a very moody, bleak and windy day here in Salford. And I've just saw a seagull with a bobby hat on and some gloves. It's that cold, seriously. Now, this is Whit Lane here, and I'm from Whit Lane. So God knows it, I could have got sucked into these gangs maybe when I was, if I was born in the 1800s. And I purely chose to document the Whit Lane scuttling gang just because I'm from here. And it's something that interests me a bit. So I've just come onto the river Wally to seek a bit of refuge from the wind, because it doesn't seem to be as windy than it is walking through the estate. So I'm going to cut through the estate, but you'll have to excuse me if the wind sort of interferes a bit. Now, the Whit Lane scuttling gang were called the Buffalo Bill Gang, and they drew inspiration from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which came to, I think it was in, it came to Odsal for 5 months, and these scuttlers went and seen this show and drew inspiration from it and was like, wow, and they instantly called themselves the Buffalo Bill Gang, and they hailed from Whit Lane. Now, just straight over sort of that sort of way was the Pendleton Colliery and the pits and stuff like that, and Agecroft Colliery. Now, it was reputed that that was the toughest pit to ever work in. It was the hottest pit, and the conditions were really, really bleak. So to actually work in those conditions, you were classed as quite a tough person, and you must have had a bit of a stout heart to get up every morning and go down the pit, especially if it was, you know, reported to be the most hardest one to be in. Now, a lot of them workers, the younger lads, were scuttlers, and they lived on this estate and right away through Whit Lane.
The Buffalo Bill Gang wasn't your average scuttling gang. They was well organised, and they used strategies and methods, almost a game plan if you like. They even had their own whistling code. They'd have whistles for attacking, whistles for help, and even whistles for others to join in. An incident had occurred on the 18th of January 1890. 25-year-old colliery worker John Conliffe was making his way through Whit Lane after a night on the ale. At the corner of the street were the Buffalo Bill Gang. A bombardment of insults came John's way.
Get over here, you dickhead.
But he didn't bite, and he tried his best to run through the maze of terraced houses. And after a frantic chase, he found himself running into Jimmy Foley and Joe Allen. Both of them worked at Pendleton Pit. The two scuttlers had the belts tied tightly around the wrists, leaving the loose buckles swinging down before their hands. Foley swung first, which left John Conliffe lying face down in the murky water of the gutter. But they didn't stop there. Foley gave a coded whistle, and it led the rest of the gang to where they were. They began to beat John more, before he eventually blacked out. Bloodied and bruised, John picked himself up, and he made his way home. He was met by his two brothers, 29-year-old Joe, 22-year-old Charlie, and they all worked down at Pendleton Pit. Joe Conliffe was the eldest of the three brothers, and in the area, he had a reputation of being quite an hard lad. He was bigger, tougher, and stronger than any of the younger scuttlers. Within minutes, the three brothers clapped eyes on the gang.
Right, you stay here, leave this to me.
But before Joe could get his hands on Foley, the female scuttlers came out of nowhere, and they ambushed the three brothers, attacking them with the brass-tipped clogs. A scuttle had erupted, and the sound of the pandemonium pricked the ears of two beat constables that were just round the corner. The police defused the situation, but the brothers didn't let it lie there.
Just let it go.
Not letting it go, alright?
Word got around that Big Joe Conliffe was out to avenge his brother's beating, and Alan and Fowler was nowhere to be seen. But they had one problem. Monday morning was fast approaching, and they all worked down at the pit, and rather pitching for work that Monday morning, the two scuttlers decided to hand themselves in to the police. Jimmy Fowler and Joe Allen both received 6 months in jail.
Send him back down to his cell, boys.
And as for the girls, they all got 3 months. In total, there was 13 members of the Buffalo Bill gang that were sentenced back on that day of 1890. The two cities had seen enough violence and carnage to last them a lifetime. And prison was something that the Scuttlers didn't really take seriously. So much so that they often boasted to one another about the sentences. Were these kids bad from birth? Or just simply a byproduct of their environment? And when would all this end? One day, there was hope. The introduction of the Salford Lads Club, Adelphi Lads Club, and St Mark's proved to be the answer. The Salford Lads Club's motto was simple: to brighten young lives and make good citizens. It provided kids a chance to represent their club and compete with fellow lads clubs in sport. On the opening night of the Salford Lads Clubs, there was almost 700 boys that were queuing outside eager to join, and it gave them an outlet, a second chance. They swapped the street fighting for sports such as snooker, boxing, and most importantly, football. Football was the most popular sport amongst the lads, and so much so, the up-and-coming generation of scuttlers decided to follow in the peers' footsteps and leave the street violence behind them. This new generation got together a talented team for St Mark's, and they went under the name of West Gorton Football Club. Fast forward 10 years later, they eventually renamed themselves and became Manchester City. Sadly, a lot of these lads clubs have now closed, or they've vanished off our streets forever, leaving nothing but fond childhood memories and a sense of being young. Places like these have helped stamp out street crime. It's been proven with the Scuttlers, and it's well documented that there's a pandemic and rise in young gang and knife crime today. But I'm pretty sure the closure of these brilliant places have had an impact on our society, so maybe we can learn from our past to help our future.